Welcome to Our Vices, a short program focusing on the office of the Vice Presidency, by detailing each Vice President's time in office in 3 short questions. On to question number 1. How did Daniel D. Tompkins become our 6th Vice President? Born in 1774 in Scarsdale, New York, to a dirt-poor farming family, Tompkins nonetheless attended Columbia University, becoming class valedictorian upon his graduation in 1795. 2 years later, he passed the New York bar and began working as a lawyer. Tompkins married Hannah Minthorpe, whose family had connections to the powerful Tammany Society of New York City and New York State politics. In 1802, Tompkins was elected to the New York State Assembly, winning re-election in 1804. But resigned as he was appointed to the New York State Supreme Court. Forsaking the Tammany Society and aligning with the Clintonian faction of New York politics, Tompkins won his race for the governorship in 1807. Once in office, Tompkins quickly shifted his association from the Clintonians, led by Vice President George Clinton, and his nephew DeWitt, to the Virginia faction of the Democratic-Republican Party. You see, political parties at the time were more or less coalitions of state parties, and not like our parties today. George Clinton made a passive caucus bid for the presidency in 1808 against James Madison, while DeWitt made an aggressive cross-party campaign against Madison in 1812. Tompkins picked the winning side, aligning with the Virginia dynasty. As governor, Tompkins supported Madison's decision to go to war with the United Kingdom, and throughout the War of 1812, Tompkins actively served as both governor and protector of New York State, taking out a massive amount of private loans to fund its defense. For his service, Madison offered him a cabinet position, that of Secretary of State in 1814, which Tompkins had to decline as he needed the greater income afforded to him as governor to pay down his debts. By 1816, Tompkins felt he had distinguished himself enough to run for president. The New York State Legislature agreed and gave their endorsement. However, at the Democratic-Republican Convention in D.C., Tompkins found less support, and James Monroe nabbed the nomination. Monroe was a Virginian like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. They enjoyed wide support in the South, which cemented their national viability. Northerners lacked a similar level of cohesion at this point. Monroe was also a founding father, fighting in the Revolutionary War when Tompkins was a toddler. Again, Monroe had the clear national viability Tompkins lacked. However, as a vice presidential candidate, Tompkins was very promising. New York now had 29 electoral votes, more than any other state. And the leading candidate for the Federalist Party ticket was Rufus King of New York. Tompkins, as sitting governor of New York, could pull the votes away from King. Tompkins was also a Northerner, while Monroe was a Southerner, balancing the ticket. Tompkins won the VP nomination and would accept nothing less. In the election of 1816, the Monroe-Tompkins ticket trounced the Federalists, 183 to 34 in the Electoral College, successfully securing New York for the Democratic Republicans. Tompkins would be the 3rd vice president from New York, supporting a president from Virginia. Which brings us to our second question. What did Daniel Tompkins accomplish as vice president? When Tompkins took his oath of office, it had been almost 2.5 years since the last vice president, Elbridge Gerry, died and his position left vacant, as we had yet to develop a procedure for replacing the vice president in just such a situation. Tompkins only had a short while in office before his health became a concern. During the War of 1812, Tompkins fell off his horse, causing numerous injuries that still plagued him. By the fall of 1817, he was almost bedridden and had taken to drinking. He himself anticipated having to resign from the office of the vice presidency in his near future, but managed to rally his spirits to preside over the Senate. Tompkins, like former Vice President George Clinton, did not care for the high society of D.C., being quite Southern in flavor at the time. Tompkins, despite his prominence, had never held a position in Washington before, and very much missed New York, returning whenever he could, which would often reflect negatively upon him. One such example being the 1819 debates concerning statehood for Missouri and the status of slavery in the territories. Tompkins presided over the Senate at the beginning of these debates, but again retired to New York. Many Northerners viewed him as cowardly for doing so, and a tool of the Virginia dynasty. The resulting legislation was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, for which Tompkins can take no credit or blame. In a move right out of Aaron Burr's playbook, while in New York and still VP, Tompkins ran for governor of New York, but lost by a hair in a bitter contest to incumbent DeWitt Clinton. Nevertheless, in the very same year of 1820, the Monroe-Tompkins ticket won their re-election, so he continued to be vice president, which in this era of good feelings seemed inevitable. Tompkins would unenthusiastically begin another term, missing his inauguration in D.C. and taking his oath of office in New York. His most notable accomplishment during his second term was presiding over the Third New York State Constitutional Convention. An up-and-coming New York politician by the name of Martin Van Buren and his allies just about drafted Tompkins for the job as a symbol of resistance to the Clintonian faction of New York politics. The new state constitution greatly expanded suffrage in New York State, but kept Tompkins in New York from August to November of 1821. Then in 1822, this proved to be a year full of public embarrassment for Tompkins, as his mounting debts and lack of record-keeping during the War of 1812 in defense of New York led to the entirety of his salary as vice president to be garnished by the state of New York. Tompkins then coerced the federal government into suing him just so he could vindicate himself in court and to the public. Eventually, he was found to not have misappropriated funds, and furthermore, the court acknowledged the personal debts he had taken on in service of his country, and in a drawn-out process would be compensated for those debts. With this decades-long scandal finally resolved, Tompkins attended to his duties in the Senate like never before. However, his alcoholism left him a shell of the man he used to be. Once the most ambitious man in New York, now in D.C. he appeared far older than his age and quite frail by all accounts. But unlike his two predecessors, Tompkins would survive the vice presidency. Which brings us to our final question. What legacy did Daniel D. Tompkins leave behind during his time as vice president? Legacy number 1. Tompkins got out of the way. In becoming vice president, Tompkins opened the door for DeWitt Clinton to successfully run for governor of New York. DeWitt's most prominent legacy being the Erie Canal. Tompkins' 2 terms in office were during the so-called era of good feelings, where in one party, the Democratic Republicans ruled the roost, as the Federalist Party lost national viability. This meant that for the election of 1824, outgoing President Monroe's entire inner circle, and some from the outer circle, would now be competing with one another for positions. The good feelings would be no more. So follow me on this. Tompkins made it known to John Quincy Adams that he would be retiring from politics. Adams then competed against 3 other Monroe secretaries, a senator, and the Speaker of the House, squeaking out a win for the White House in what became known as the corrupt bargain, just barely becoming president. Legacy number 2. 6 tie-breaking votes in the Senate, which actually puts him in the top half of vice presidents in terms of casting this important vote. And just to end this episode on a down note, as I like to do from time to time, poor Daniel D. Tompkins barely outlived his term of office, dying at the tender age of 50, the youngest of any former or current vice president to pass away. So too with Tompkins, the first phase of our vice presidential history passes on, as the position quietly sliding into obscurity will be upended by our next vice president, John C. Calhoun.